Let's bring in NBC Justice and Intel correspondent Ken Delaney. And David Rohde is senior executive editor for national security at NBC News and former FBI general counsel, former senior member of the Robert Mueller special counsel investigation, and MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissmann. It's good to have all of you here. David, I'm going to start with you. You and I had a conversation, I think it was just a week ago, when we were talking about Kash Patel. I know you read his memoir. We just heard him say he wants to shut down the Hoover building, turn it into a museum of the deep state. But what else in your reading should people know about the man who may replace Chris Wray at the head of the FBI?
Thank you so much. And I think in recent days, Patel has said he's not going to shut down the big headquarters building in Washington. But it's the term deep state that he just used. In the memoir, he lists 60 people who he says are current members of the deep state, but he presents no evidence of any way they've broken the law. And Ken can talk about this and Andrew, but there is alarm, I would say, about what Kash Patel would do as FBI director. This is the most powerful law enforcement organization in the country. It had a problem for decades under J. Edgar Hoover of being used by Hoover and presidents to persecute their enemies and persecute certain groups in this country. And the thing I'm hearing, at least from current and former FBI and Justice Department officials, is that Kash Patel is the wrong person to lead the FBI. There are other people, committed conservatives, committed Republicans, who would be far better, and that he will come in with an agenda, conspiracy theories, and start launching investigations that are politically motivated. And this is what, critics say, and Trump says Biden did, but I have not found evidence of that. So it's really who replaces Wray that is the key question at this point.
So, let me ask you this question, because right now he is the person who Donald Trump says he wants to replace Chris Wray. And a source familiar with the Trump transition team's thinking just said the following when asked for a response to Wray's resignation. And this is the quote: "The transition team is confident in Kash Patel and confident he will be ready to serve the American people on day one if he should be confirmed," which seems to be against the odds, David. Is there any doubt he will start taking some of those actions on day one?
Oh, I think there's no doubt. I mean, he has said the 2020 election was stolen. He has said the Trump-Russia investigation by Robert Mueller never should have been carried out. He's talked about, firing large groups of people. I've talked to people who he cites in his book for allegedly committing these deep state crimes, and they don't even understand what he's talking about. They seem more to be people who he disagrees with politically or people he's had bad interactions with earlier in his career. So I don't want to be too harsh here. It's up to the Senate. But I just want to emphasize the level of concern among current and former FBI officials that Kash Patel is the wrong person to run the FBI is very, very high. There are other appropriate directors that Trump could choose, or more appropriate people, more qualified, who don't use these deep state conspiracy theories, who could, I think, or they think, serve the Trump administration well. But Kash Patel is alarming a lot of people.
David Rohde, thank you very much. And Ryan, I know you want to jump in here, so go ahead.
Hey there. Yeah. So I think, one of the things to look at here as well is that Kash Patel does have these relationships with a lot of these these whistleblowers, as they describe themselves, these conservatives who have a lot of complaints about the FBI. Now they call themselves the Suspendables. And, I've been talking with a lot of folks about what their views on Kash Patel is. And, he has pretty close relationships with them. In fact, he actually supported a number of them financially through his group, the Kash Foundation, when a lot of them were sort of pushed out of the Bureau. And, a couple of them, the Inspector General discovered that, in fact, the Justice Department had sort of been using the suspension of their clearances process as a way to sort of push them out of the Bureau. So there was some legitimacy to some of the claims that they were making about the way that the internal process had been used. But, what you essentially have now is a lot of people a lot of people in Kash Patel's circle who really do want to see a lot of a huge change to the Bureau, a huge change to the FBI. And that is really, as David was highlighting there, is really worrying a lot of folks within the Bureau and what the future is going to hold for them, Chris.
Andrew Weissmann, let's go back to today and the decision that Chris Wray made. And I want to remind folks that back during his own confirmation hearing, he said very clearly, and I think repeatedly, that he would not pledge his loyalty to Donald Trump, which is the appropriate response for an FBI director. And I want to read part of what he said at that time, Andrew. If I am given the honor of leading this agency, I will never allow the FBI's work to be driven by anything other than the facts, the law, and the impartial pursuit of justice, period. Full stop. My loyalty is to the Constitution and to the rule of law. Those have been my guideposts throughout my career, and I will continue to adhere to them no matter the test. The fact that he is essentially pushed out from the FBI directorship 3 years before his term was going to be up, what does it tell us, Andrew, about this moment, and what might it tell us about what's to come?
Sure. Well, I think from Chris Wray's perspective, he knows that the FBI director, in spite of having a 10-year term under this congressional provision that you can serve no more than 10 years, but on the other hand, the whole signaling of it being a 10-year term was Congress saying this is an apolitical position that's supposed to span multiple terms of a presidency. Even a president who would serve for 8 years, the FBI director has this 10-year term. But having said all that, obviously a president can fire an FBI director. In the past, it has been for cause except for Donald Trump. In other words, but for Donald Trump, we've never had an FBI director removed except when it's for cause. And it's very rare that that's ever happened. So I think that Chris Wray was trying to say, look, I'm currently going to serve out the time that the current president, President Biden, wants me here. I'm going to serve that out. But he doesn't want to drag the FBI or himself through a sort of confirmation hearing for the next FBI director where he and his conduct and the FBI's conduct would be one of the things under scrutiny. Having said all that, I'm not sure that's, as Anthony said just a moment ago, I'm not sure that is the better call here. If the FBI did something right or wrong, it should be subject to scrutiny. That's not something that should be hidden from the American people. If Chris Wray himself has done things right or wrong, that also is something that should be the subject of hearings. And I think the damage of what Chris Wray is doing is that it undermines the congressional intent that, but for there being cause, that an FBI director is apolitical. And so if Donald Trump
for a
wanted
second
to,
there, if I can, just because this was just handed to me. When you talk about congressional intent, is it possible there are members of Congress who want to undermine what a previous Congress wanted to do? And I say that because Chuck Grassley, Republican from Iowa, just issued a letter that he sent today to Chris Wray, calling on him, as well as the deputy director, Paul Abate, to accept accountability for what he says is their failed leadership, and mention specifically something we've been talking about over the last 20 minutes or so since this decision was announced, the FBI raid on Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence, the politics of this that is showing itself again, Andrew, in an agency that is supposed to be allowed to be above the political fray.
Yeah, so Senator Grassley had issued this letter a few days ago saying, with a litany of critiques of Christopher Wray and also his deputy director, and clearly signaling that he was going to support a new FBI director being put in place. But again, that's only one senator. And the issue is it really serving the FBI itself and the American public by having Chris Wray do what he's doing now? Or is it undermining the very idea that the FBI director is not supposed to be a political appointee who changes every 4 years as the presidency changes? That was the whole goal of Congress enacting this 10-year term, was to make it clear, a little bit like the Federal Reserve, that this is supposed to be something that is apart from the sort of winds of politics. And having worked at the FBI, I have to tell you, it is really palpable when I was there just how apolitical that institution is. It does not run like Congress. It is not the Senate. It is not the House. It is not the White House with a political agenda. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It is really just following the facts and the law. And so the other option for Chris Wray was to just continue serving his 10-year term. And if and when Donald Trump were to decide as president that he wants a new director, make him have to fire him and let the American public see that he's treating this position as a sort of as a political position when that was not congressional intent. And that, I think, is a good message for the FBI personnel as well, that you want the director to be seen as apart from the political system. And so I fear that, without casting any aspersions on Chris Wray's intent, I'm sure that he has got good faith in terms of what was probably a very difficult decision, that I'm not sure in the long term that what he's doing isn't sort of capitulating in advance in a way that undermines the goal of keeping the FBI apolitical. And just to make a fine point on this, I can't imagine that any fair-minded person wants law enforcement to be thinking about politics when they're deciding who to prosecute and who not to prosecute, that it's the facts and the law that should be governing it. It's what separates us from many, many authoritarian countries where law enforcement is just an arm of the political state and is not operating in that independent way.